Hello, in Macbeth, Malcolm describes the magical healing powers of the king. How he solicits heaven himself best knows, but strangely visited people all swollen and ulcerous, pitiful to the eye, the mere despair of surgery he cures, hanging a golden stamp about their necks. The idea that a monarch could heal with his touch flowed from the idea that a king was sacred, appointed by God, and above the judgment of earthly powers. This was called the divine right of kings, and it entered so powerfully into British culture during the 17th century that it shaped the pomp and circumstance of the Stuart monarchs, imbued the writing of Shakespeare, provoked the political thinking of Milton and Locke, and helped a regicide about a century and a half before the French Revolution. With me to discuss the divine right of kings are Justin Champion, Professor of the History of Early Modern Ideas at Royal Holloway College, University of London, Claire Jackson, Lecturer and Director of Studies in History at Trinity Hall, Cambridge, and Tom Healy, Professor of Renaissance Studies at Birkbeck College, University of London. Justin Champion, this is an idea that can be traced back, the idea of the ruler as a god can be traced back a long way, but it became particularly important in Europe during and after the Reformation in the 16th century. Can you explain why it emerged and became so powerful at that particular time?
I think if we go all the way back to the pre-Reformation period, that the idea of divine right monarchy or divine right government is commonplace. It's an assumption, the basic tools really for thinking about politics and obligation and perhaps even sovereignty. It's a theocratic argument, so it's driven in one sense by Catholic theology. With the Reformation, the fracturing of that carapace of Catholic theology means if you are a Protestant country, you need to think of ways of justifying the authority in your own nation. And the monarchy is the ready way to do that. And we can see, perhaps for example, in the frontispiece of the Great Bible of 1540, Henry VIII represents himself as being whispered in the ear by God. The verbum Dei is striking him on the head. It's a descending theory of government that allows a Protestant community to have direct access to God without going through the papacy. So it's sort of counterintuitive that divine right monarchy, one would think, is a traditional Catholic viewpoint, but in fact it's invented in a much more profound way by Protestant culture.
The idea of a person, a man, it always was a man, and being divinely inspired, being divinely given the gift to rule. Well, had that been around the discussions in medieval and even earlier times in Europe? Let's stick to Europe for this discussion.
Absolutely. In the earlier period, one, as a political task, wants to know where authority comes from. And there are really two ways of thinking about this. Either political authority ascends from the body of the people, from the community, and there are all sorts of classical traditions for thinking about that. But the dominant ideology is a descending theory of government. Government comes from God, and inevitably in the medieval period there is a conflict between the sources for that voice of God. Is it the papacy, which is the dominant form, or a civil government? So we can think of the political theory in the pre-Reformation period, perhaps all the way back to the 9th century, as being theocratic, but also being a contest between civil authority, a regnum, and sacred authority, a sacerdotium. So it's priest versus king. And a lot of those debates are, for example, focused on arguments about the coronation. When a king is anointed, does that create his sacred authority? If it does, is it the church that's creating that channel of grace or not? And there are a lot of very technical debates about precisely how authority is divine and how the king himself gets that authority.
But even before the Reformation, therefore, we have two camps. I mean, they're not what they become after the Reformation, as it were, king versus pope, but there are two camps. There always seem to have been, reading for this programme, two views about this, the theocratic view and, loosely, the anti-theocratic view, that the earthly powers and heavenly powers.
Absolutely, and I think thinkers like Marsilius of Padua and William of Ockham want to recognise in one sense that secular authority has to be the root cause of sovereignty, although they don't use that word, within a state. Where does obligation come from? Do we obey a king or an institution because it's created by God, or because we've in some sense consented to it? So I think there are those two tensions all of the way through. That's theory. We've always got to remember this is practice as well. In any parish or in any community, there will be powerful men who are not only princes and magistrates, but are priests. So the conflict is one that's not only fought in the mind, it's fought out in real life, if you like.
Tom Healy, to play around with the time before the Reformation, before we get to it a little longer. St. Augustine was massively influential in the Middle Ages and right through as a theologian and as a philosopher and as a man whom people followed and so on. Had he planted any ideas in this area which were taken up and were influential in the shaping of the ideas we're going to talk about?
Indeed. You drew attention to this constant tension between the secular and the sacred, and this is really at the heart of Augustine's most important work, his City of God, Civitas Dei. And in that, Augustine marks out two cities, the city of men and the city of God, and he suggests that really human activity should be directed at the city of God. And this is ultimately, of course, to the afterlife, to our where we go after we die, and to some extent this means that we should not take too active a view about the conditions of that we live under now, that we should, in a sense, be obedient. But it also supports that idea that effectively that God is looking after our interests. He's directing us towards the city of God.
Is there any sense in Augustine that he is talking about the place of the ruler in all this? And in the sense that Justin was referring to?
Yes, because what happens within Augustine is that the city of God is not just a spiritual domain. It's also something that can be created on the earth. I mean, he feels that the city of men is fundamentally chaotic. It's tumultuous. It's filled with self-interest, whereas the city of God is interested in higher pursuits. So he posits an earthly life presided over by a ruler or a government who has divine authority, and which we fundamentally give up our rights to. We agree to be governed by them. And this is a healthy form of government, against a healthy form of existence, against that type of chaotic, self-interested life that classical antiquity had experienced. So he provides a powerful argument, in a sense, for this model that through God to the monarch and then the dispensation down to people. But importantly for the Renaissance, I think, Augustine also contains within his thought the very kernel that will actually affect a questioning of divine right and divine authority. Because what he's anxious about is, if in this tumultuous concerns of the city of men, if excess takes place, if you have a figure who seems to be following his own appetites, is he really a godly ruler? Can actually although there might be a claim to divine authority, in fact that might be a false claim, and that haunts the Renaissance. Sorry.
No, sorry, please finish, I interrupted.
That haunts the Renaissance, particularly in the post-Reformation period, that although technically there's always an acceptance that the monarch should and can claim divine authority, that individual monarchs might actually either be self-deceiving or particularly deceiving their people, that they are actually treacherous to God and satanic in that model.
Again, we have this sort of duality, almost as divinity is one thing, but absolutism and excess is another
Indeed.
thing. Can I just fast forward 1,000 years, I'm awfully sorry about this, to Erasmus, and bring us to the year before Luther pinned the notes to the door of the Wittenberg. Erasmus wrote The Education of a Christian Prince, came out in 1516, and he is a thinker, theologian, Dutch humanist, great theologian. So he is a thinker in this in the process we're going to describe. So can you briefly tell us the place he occupied, and then we'll move on?
Well, Erasmus takes up on this model that the true monarch is a Christian monarch. That is, someone who follows the teachings of the Bible. So he takes the idea, the classical idea of the philosopher prince, and he says that a Christian ruler is also a philosophical ruler. So he's in this model of moderate. He seeks justice and the best for his people through his own moderation in his own life, and that he becomes a type of ideal model for his people. So again, that the excesses of appetite are put under control, and that creates a health in himself, and as a result a healthy nation. And this is the model that God wishes, that this points us towards true government, which is ultimately interested in our afterlife, pointing us in the direction of heaven. And so he also picks up on this model that is against excessive tyranny and creates this ideal of what the true prince, the true monarch who is divinely ordained should reflect. And then he similarly creates this dilemma. If a monarch is seen to be acting excessively, can he legitimately claim divinity?
And in 1517 marks, let us call it the beginning, well, it is the beginning of the Reformation. At the end of that century, James VI of Scotland, soon became James I of England, published two books in 1597, was Basilicon Doron and The True Law of Free Monarchies, in which he declared that kings, even by God himself, are called God. He was a very considerably accomplished theologian, a great linguist who said he'd read everything of theological value in every European language. Can you? It's a big move forward, and can you give us the gist of his arguments?
Yes, I mean, who better to speak about the divine right of kings than a monarch who thinks he's divinely ordained himself? I mean, I think if we're interested in studying political ideas and the context in which they're written, I think the view of kingship from the throne commands a unique fascination and relevance. And as you say, James publishes two major works in the 1590s while he's still King James VI of Scotland, The True Law of Free Monarchies, which is more of a theoretical work, and the Basilicon Doron, which is more of a manual of kingship in that sort of speculum principiis handbook of princes genre. I think to understand where James is coming from ideologically, though, we need to go just back a little bit into Scottish history to understand where his ideological makeup is formed. He's born 1566. He's crowned when he's only 13 months old in 1567, following the forcible deposition of his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots. And her forced abdication, had been orchestrated by a group of Protestant nobles who included George Buchanan, who thereafter assumes responsibility for James's education. And I think through Buchanan's writing, we get an idea of the kind of intellectual experiences and theories to which James was exposed as a young child. Buchanan also writes two major works on kingship, the De Jure Regni Apud Scotus, which is published 1579, though probably written in the 1560s, and A History of Scotland. And they're radically desacralised. They're very secular theories. They draw a lot on Ciceronian Stoic ideas and basically argue that a monarch is there to serve the people, that there's a contract between ruler and ruled that's affirmed by the coronation oath, and that if by any chance a ruler breaks that contract with the people, that the subjects have a right and actually a duty to remove that monarch. Buchanan tends to see a monarch in the same way as one would see a doctor, with responsibility for the health of the body politic. And if the body politic becomes diseased, one changes one's doctor. So this is the kind of theory that's put forward to James. I mean, it's a very incendiary doctrine of tyrannicide, that subjects even have the duty to depose a monarch and even kill them. And his History of Scotland outlines exactly for James how this had operated right back through ancient Scottish constitutionalism. One sees a series of monarchs who, if they've gone down the route of tyranny, a virtuous citizenry has risen up and removed them. So really, once James achieves his majority and once he begins to rule Scotland as an adult king from the 1580s onwards, that also coincides with Buchanan's death, his intellectual project really becomes one of legitimating or re-legitimating his own kingship, perhaps rehabilitating the Scottish monarchy with some of the dignity that it had suffered at the hands of Mary, Queen of Scots. And that expresses itself most fully in the two works, The True Law of Free Monarchies and the Basilicon Doron. I think they're both very short. They're both very readable. They're quite terse in their construction. I think there's probably 4 strands to The True Law of Free Monarchies.
You have to move forward a bit. So
yeah,
can you just
very brief,
crack on a bit? Yeah.
Just, I mean, very, very 4 brief points, really. Monarchy is divinely ordained, that kings are accountable to God alone, that hereditary succession governs the monarchy, and that subjects have no right of resistance. And those are the really sort of 4 points.